Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And you're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Good morning, everybody, and welcome again to the program. We'll continue now with a reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. The history of the Jesuits. Very important information for those who wish to understand what is happening in the world today. What is the New World Order? And who is in control of it? R.W. Thompson gives us the example of the Jesuits in history, and particularly the history of the Jesuits in their reductions, their little communist villages in Paraguay, as an example of what the Jesuits would impose upon the world if it were in their power to do so. Now, we'll retreat one paragraph for continuity purposes as usual, and begin with the first full paragraph on page 175 if you're following along in your own copy of the book. It says, "The praise ought not to be withheld from the Jesuits, that the natives who were thus brought under their influence were better and more kindly treated than those who were compelled to submit to the dominion of Spaniards or Portuguese beyond the limits of Paraguay. They, quote, partook of their labors, of their amusements, of their joys, and of their sorrows. They visited daily every house in which lay a sick person, whom they served as the kindest nurse, and to whom they seemed to be ministering genii," unquote. But it says, by these and other kindnesses, they brought the Indians to look upon them with a feeling bordering upon idolatry. That's right, the Jesuits were idolized in these Jesuit reductions for their benevolence to some degree. Never mind that it was an autocratic, monarchical theocracy, and the Jesuits would tolerate no deviation from their rules. They were, nonetheless, benevolent and provided everything that the Guarani Indians needed. They were their providers. Okay? And it says, but while they were friends, they were also sovereigns, and, quote, governed with absolute and unquestioning authority, unquote. This was a necessary and indispensable part of their system of government, which embodied the Jesuit idea of a Christian republic. The Jesuits insist that this new world order of theirs is going to be a Christian republic. But obviously their definition of Christianity is much different than mine, particularly, and hopefully those of my listeners. But this Christian republic was dictatorial, autocratic, and would not tolerate any deviation from the unquestioning authority of the Jesuits. Now it says it was in everything pertaining to the management of public affairs as an absolute monarchy, with all its powers centered in the general at Rome, the Jesuit general, the Black Pope, whose authority was accepted as equal to that of God, and to whose command obedience was expected from all. Okay? The Jesuit general is the voice of God on earth, infallible, and against which there is no protest. Okay? Now it says, apart from this governing authority, universal equality prevailed. Universal equality. The Jesuit general is supreme and infallible, and we are all on a level. Okay? Kind of a mirror image of that described by the apostles, right? Christ is the head of the church, and we are all brethren. And it says the principles of socialism or communism, very much as now understood, governed all the reductions. So what they imposed upon these Guarani Indians was socialism, communism. And that's why all their needs were provided for. That's part of the socialist or communist order of things. So keep that in mind, the idea that the Jesuits, when once given an opportunity in the world to create a society unmolested by any outside interference, created a socialist and communist government, a communist or socialist society. Now it says everything necessary to the material comfort and prosperity of the Indians was in common. Okay, the common good. All the goods of the reductions were shared. Kind of sounds like the Pope's recent encyclical, doesn't it? Caritas in Veritate. And it says each family had a portion of land set apart for cultivation. They also learned trades, and many of them, both men and women, became experts. Okay? Under Jesuit influence, people are educated to be producers. All right? Producers. Now, but the earnings of the whole were deposited in common storehouses at each reduction, and distributed by the Jesuits in such portions to each individual as necessity required. Okay? They took care of their every need. There were provisions made in a central storehouse that met the needs of all the requirements of those who were enslaved in these reductions. And it's, quote, even meat was portioned from the public slaughterhouses in the same way, unquote. And it says the surplus produce remaining after these distributions went to Europe and sold or exchanged for wares and merchandise solely at the discretion of the Jesuits. So what was left over after all the needs of the Guarani Indians were met were sent to Europe as merchandise, trade. The Jesuits are excellent traders, commerce. They run all the ships at sea, right? All the foreign trade. People don't understand who's in control of the merchants of the earth. Why, the great merchants, the Jesuits. And it says everything was conducted in obedience to them, and nothing contrary to their order was tolerated. Rigid rules of conduct and hours of labor were prescribed, and the violators of them were subject to corporal punishment. Houses of worship, colleges, and palatial residences for the Jesuit fathers were built by the common labor and at the expense of the common treasury. Suffrage was universal, but, quote, the sanction of the Jesuits was necessary to the validity of the election, unquote. So everybody had the right to vote, but the Jesuits picked all the candidates. They learned early on how to control the government, and that's how they control the government of the United States. Everybody in the United States has a right to vote, but the Jesuits pick all the candidates. How quaint. It says, in fact, says Nicolini, quote, the Jesuits substituted themselves for the state or the community, unquote, a fact which fully establishes the monarchical and theocratic character of the government. The Jesuits were the state, and the Jesuits were the church in Paraguay. And that's how it is in the United States today. The giant Jesuit reduction called the United States of America. And it says, in order to teach the confiding Indians that obedience to authority was their chiefest duty, we're being taught that obedience to the civil power is our chiefest duty, even in the churches today. I mean, the Jesuits would love what's being taught in the Romans chapter 13 churches in this country, the 501c3 Romans chapter 13 churches. It says, in order to teach the confiding Indians that obedience to authority was their chiefest duty, they were subjected to rules of conduct and intercourse which were which were enforced with the strictest severity. They were watched in everything, the searching eyes of the Jesuits being continually upon them. Now they don't have to use their eyes. They can use keyloggers on your computer, and they can read your email. Of course, we don't call the Jesuits doing this. We say the CIA is doing it. You know, the Catholics in action at the CIA and the NSA. Now, everything that you do on your computer is like going to a Jesuit confessor. And there's not even a presumption of privacy in any form of communication anymore. But back in the day, before the Jesuits had this kind of technology, they had to use their own eyes to monitor the people. And it says they watched in everything, the searching eyes of the Jesuits being continually upon them. They constituted, in fact, a state of society reaching the Jesuit ideal completely. That is, docile, tractable, submissive, obedient, and without the least real semblance of manhood. You know, I hate to keep making these analogies to the United States of America because sooner or later I'm going to begin to offend my listeners. I'll just leave it up to my listeners to do what I'm doing in my own mind right now, and those who have an eye or an ear to hear, let them see and hear. And those who don't, well, don't. But anybody who is paying attention to what's going on in this country today is simply seeing the manhood stripped from manliness in this country. And we're becoming unquestioning dupes, unquestioning little slaves, not thinking for ourselves, not questioning authority, and just simply doing what we're told. You know, like a child. That's what children do because they don't have the capacity to think or to question. They just trust and obey because there's no other way. But God's people are to give up childish things, aren't they, when they become a man and stand on their own 2 feet. That's not happening in the United States, just as it didn't happen in the Paraguayan reductions. Now he continues, having thus completed their subjugation, energetic measures were adopted to render any change in their condition impossible. For this purpose, care was taken to exclude all other than Jesuit influences, that's control of the press, right? Control of information, no outside influence, no information passes in these Jesuit reductions unless it's micromanaged by the Jesuits. It says, for this purpose, care was taken to exclude all other than Jesuit influences and to sow the seeds of disaffection toward everything European, the object being to surround them with a high wall of ignorance and superstition which no European influences could overleap and within which the authority would be unbounded. They were instructed that the Spaniards and the Portuguese were their enemies, that the ecclesiastics and monkish missionaries sent over by the church, I'm fine till the program starts, and then this frog starts picking on me. Somebody pray for me, will you? Get rid of this frog so I can continue. All right, the Jesuits are controlling all the information that these Guarani Indians are getting. And the Jesuits are also determining for these Guarani Indians who their friends are and who their enemies are. They were indoctrinated by their government to see as enemies those who their government, the Jesuits, saw as enemies. They were not allowed to think for themselves. They were not allowed to question the authority. They just simply, clicked their heels, saluted smartly, turned about, and did thought whatever the Jesuits told them. He says, for this purpose, care was taken to exclude all other than Jesuit influences and to sow the seeds of disaffection towards everything European, the object being to surround them with a high wall of ignorance and superstition. You know, there are plenty of superstitious. Every cultist in this country is superstitious, but the ignorance in the United States of America, when viewed from the context of history and how the Jesuits operate, in comparison with how our press and our government operates, ignorance defines us here in the United States of America. Totally ignorant of this history. That's why we're unable to think for ourselves and to come to any right conclusions about who it is that's controlling our government, because all the information we get is managed in order to protect that institution that controls our government, just like the government of Paraguay. For this purpose, care was taken to exclude all other than Jesuit influences and to sow the seeds of disaffection, that's hatred, towards everything European, the object being to surround them with a high wall of ignorance and superstition which no European influences could overleap, and within which their authority would be unbounded. The Jesuits' authority would be unbounded. They were instructed, like the Spaniards and Portuguese they were instructed that the Spaniards and the Portuguese were their enemies, that the ecclesiastics and monkish missionaries sent over by the church were unworthy of obedience or imitation, and that the only true religion was that which emanated from their society and had their approval. If these simple-minded people were taught anything about the church, that is, the Roman Catholic Church, it was with the view of convincing them that the Jesuits represented all its power, all its authority, and its virtue, and that whatsoever did not conform to their teaching was sinful and heretical. If they were told anything about the Pope, it was to represent him as inferior to the Jesuit general, who was to be regarded by them as the only infallible representative of God upon the earth. With all other, it says that all other ideas should be excluded from their minds. They were not permitted to hold any intercourse whatsoever with Europeans, for fear, undoubtedly, they might hear that there was a church at Rome and a pope higher than their general. They were not allowed to speak any language but their own, so as to render it impossible to acquire any ideas or opinions except such as could be expressed by means of its limited number of inexpressive words, that is, to keep them entirely and exclusively under Jesuit influences. To sum up the whole, without further detail, the Indians were regarded as minors under guardianship. Did you hear that? The Indians, the Guarani Indians in these Jesuit reductions in Paraguay, these very happy slaves, were regarded by the Jesuits as minors under guardianship. In other words, they were little children, and the Jesuit generals were their legal guardians, their trustees. And in this condition they remained for 150 years without the possibility of social and national development. So we have a completely isolated, insulated, and manipulated society by the Jesuits. I mean, these Guarani Indians were treated like cattle. Stripped of their manhood, they were provided their every need, and all the excess of their labor went to enrich their Jesuit fathers. It's why God said, "Call no man father upon the earth." It says they were saved, it is true, from the miseries of Portuguese slavery, but kept in such a condition of inferiority and vassalage as unfitted them for independent citizenship. Their limbs were unchained, but their minds were cabined, cribbed, and confined, says one author, within bounds so narrow for matured thought, sentiment, or reason. Okay? They were unchained, but they were nonetheless enslaved. Their minds were cabined, cribbed, and confined within bounds too narrow for matured thought, sentiment, or reason. You know, check your brain and your Bible and your manhood at the door. Just come in and do whatever we tell you to do and say whatever we tell you to say and believe whatever we tell you to believe. No manhood whatsoever. Just like little children under the trusteeship of a guardian. That's the ideal of the Jesuit reduction. And it said it would not be fair to say that the first Jesuit missionaries in Paraguay may not have been animated by the desire to improve the condition of the Indians, or to withhold from them the meed of praise justly due for the humanity of their motives. It is undoubtedly true, as already intimated, that they did shield them from many of the cruelties to which they had been subjected under the Spanish and Portuguese adventurers who overran large portions of South America in search of wealth. But it cannot be too indelibly impressed upon our minds in this age that they acted in strict obedience to the Jesuit system, which permitted no departure from absolute monarchism and centered all the duties of citizenship in obedience to themselves as the sole representatives of the only authority that was or could be legitimate. It's all about authority to the Jesuits. Who are you going to obey? Wonder what the Jesuits would do if the Guarani Indians stood up and said, "We don't need your guardianship anymore. We have Jesus Christ. And we don't need your laws and rules and regulations. We have the Bible and God's holy law." Wonder what the Jesuits would have done then. It says that not only did their strict adherence to their system make it necessary for them to hold the Indians in subjection and treat them as inferior subjects, but it involved them at last in collisions with the Spaniards and Portuguese, and obliged them to treat the latter especially as enemies, that is, the Portuguese, and to impress this fact upon the minds of the whole Indian population. The consequence of this was to create an independent and rebellious government within the Portuguese dominions, which necessarily brought the Jesuits in conflict with the legitimate authority of the Portuguese government. All of a sudden, the Portuguese government stands up and says, "You, Jesuits, and your reductions are subject to Portuguese law, and you're in rebellion." And we'll be back with more from Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately. and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll get right back to the book. What the Jesuits had been creating was a sovereign and independent government in Paraguay, which was under Portuguese dominion. That's right. The papacy had given Portugal, or Paraguay, to Portugal. But the Jesuits were occupying the territory and reduced the Indians to servitude within these reductions, and they wouldn't submit to Portuguese government direction. So it says the consequence of this was to create an independent and rebellious government within the Portuguese dominions, which necessarily brought the Jesuits in conflict with the legitimate authority of the Portuguese government. So what do you suppose Portugal did? Well, they destroyed the Jesuit reduction and stripped them of their little utopia down there. And it's indicative of what is going to happen eventually with the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. The Jesuits are going to set up a global reduction, and since it's going to encompass all the nations of the world, there won't be a Portuguese government that'll stand up to resist them, but a divine one. Just as the government of the Jesuit government in the Guarani Indian reductions in Paraguay usurped the legitimate authority of the Portuguese government, likewise the global government of the Jesuits will usurp the rightful jurisdiction of God Almighty. At the same end, but only this time a permanent end will take place. It says the consequence of this was to create an independent and rebellious government within the Portuguese dominions, which necessarily brought the Jesuits in conflict with the legitimate authority of the Portuguese government. The Jesuits are in usurpation of the legitimate jurisdiction of God Almighty in this New World Order. And it says the Jesuits foresaw this and prepared for it. It is a fair inference that all the contemporaneous facts that they desired it. At all events, they subjected the Indians at the reductions to military training and discipline so as to be prepared for such emergencies as might arise out of their relations with both the Spaniards and the Portuguese. In other words, in the New World Order, the Jesuits are going to have us making war with heaven, aren't they? Because it's heaven that's coming to liberate the people in the global Jesuit reduction. And the Jesuits are going to have us making war with the Lamb of God, aren't they? But what does Revelation chapter 17, along about verse 18, 20, 22, somewhere in there says? But the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He says, one would suppose that in a government so far separated from the rest of the world and governed by those who profess to be laboring alone for the quote-unquote greater glory of God, the arts of peace would be chiefly, if not exclusively, cultivated. But the successors of the first Jesuit missionaries thought otherwise. Consequently, besides refusing to allow the Indians any intercourse with the Europeans, they would not permit them even to leave the reductions without permission, or to receive any impressions except those emanating from themselves, or to do anything not dictated by them. Now, the equivalent of that in the New World Order is to silence any Protestant voice. Any voice originating from the Scriptures or the throne of Almighty God. They're going to be silenced. No outside divine interference in this global Jesuit reduction. That's why this program is called Inquisition Update. Okay, there's going to be a global war made against the saints of Almighty God. History is going to repeat itself again. The Jesuits are not going to tolerate any dissenting voice in this global Jesuit papal New World Order. Now it says the result was that they designed that the Indians came to look upon all Europeans, whether ecclesiastic or lay, as enemies, and the Jesuits as their only friends. They readily engaged, therefore, in the manufacture of arms and ammunition, and submitted to military discipline until they became a formidable army, subject, of course, to the command of their Jesuit superiors. That's the United States of America. The militia of the world. The most highly advanced technological warfare-making nation on the planet. And you're considered disloyal if you haven't served in the military. I don't know if anybody's told you this or not, but if you haven't served in the military, well, you're not even half a citizen. Now it says the sequel of Jesuit history proves that in all this they were unconsciously creating an antagonism which in the end overwhelmed them. And they're doing it again on a global scale. They're creating an antagonism against the throne of Almighty God, and their antagonism is going to overwhelm them. God told the ending from the beginning, and guess what? God wins in the end, and the Jesuits lose. The Antichrist loses. It says, a violent feud sprang up between the Jesuits and the Franciscan monks, which undoubtedly arose out of the claim of superiority and exclusiveness set up and persisted in by the former, that is, by the Jesuits. It may well be inferred that the Jesuits were chiefly to blame for this feud, for the reason that the Franciscans retained the confidence of the Catholic Church authorities, and the Jesuits did not. I repeat, the Jesuits did not maintain the confidence of the Roman Catholic Church, nor the kings of Europe, nor the monastic orders, nor the people. The Jesuits were universally hated, especially by Roman Catholics. And there's an awakening that needs to take place in the United States of America. An awakening of Roman Catholics in this country. Because history shows us that Roman Catholic governments, Roman Catholic people, even the Roman Catholic Church itself, was the one who consistently raised up against the Jesuits and eventually led to their suppression and extinction by a papal bull. They have to realize that the Jesuits are not a benevolent society, nor are they a Christian society, and their end is already prophesied. It was the Roman Catholics, not the Protestants. It was the Roman Catholics who kicked the Jesuits out of 83 different countries. Only England kicked out the Jesuits. A Protestant country kicked out the Jesuits. But it was supported by the Roman Catholic people. What is wrong with America? No voice of opposition is raised, either from Protestants or Catholics in this country, about the Jesuits and their influence in our government and the direction that they set for our government. Someday, the people of the United States will come to grips with this history and realize that we've been duped. We've been lied to, we've been used and manipulated, and we've been passive, unthinking children under their guardianship, and we've been trained in warfare, gun and weapons manufacturers par excellence, and traipsing all over the world, not fighting wars for our benefit, but for theirs. These are the very things that got the Jesuits kicked out of every other country in the world except the United States of America. It's because we are ignorant. And we must first admit that we are ignorant and then learn. And by learning, by wisdom and knowledge about the history of the Jesuits, then we are able to put back on our manhood and stand up for ourselves and demand that the Jesuits be kicked out of this country and destroyed altogether. Hasn't the world had enough of the Jesuit order? Hasn't the world had enough of papal tyranny? Unless we come to these conclusions, the world will once again be soaked with the blood of the innocents, the ignorant. He says, at all events, however, they were in open enmity with each other and prosecuted their controversy with an exceeding degree of bitterness upon both sides. A distinguished citizen of the United States who represented this country as minister to Paraguay alluded to this fact, and he says this, quote, the Franciscan priests in the capital regarded them, that is, the Jesuits, with envy, suspicion, and jealousy. These last fomented the animosity of the people against them, so that government, priests, and people regarded with favor rather than otherwise the destruction of the missions, the Jesuit missions, and the expulsion of their founders, unquote. Notwithstanding these hostile relations, however, between the Jesuits and the Franciscans, and the disturbed condition of affairs existing between the former and the Portuguese authorities, neither the Pope nor the King of Spain withdrew their patronage entirely from the Jesuits for some years, and not until it was made manifest that they had become an independent power which might, if not checked, result in complications injurious alike to the Church and to the State. Okay, not until the Church and the State realized the potential of these Jesuit reductions did they take it upon themselves to exterminate these Jesuit reductions and kick the Jesuits out of Paraguay. It was only when their own so-called divine and infallible authority was recognized by them as being challenged by the Jesuits themselves. Not until they saw the potential for the Jesuits to completely overthrow the Roman Catholic Church and the states under Roman Catholic Church control did they unite to take efforts to destroy the Jesuit order. That's how far it went. How far is it going to go this time? It says, but the time arrived after a while when it became necessary to impose severe restraints upon their ambition and to teach them that neither the powers of the Roman Catholic Church nor the states under her control were concentrated in their hands. They were required to learn what they had seemed not to before to have been conscious of, that the authority they exercised in Paraguay was usurped, and that if they desired to continue there as a society, they must submit to be held in proper subordination. Being unable or unwilling to realize this, they invited results which they manifestly had not anticipated. They don't anticipate their final demise either. Now it says, when the protracted controversy between Spain and Portugal about the boundaries of their respective possessions in South America reached an adjustment, it furnished an occasion for testing the obedience of the Jesuits to royal authority. The two governments, Spain and Portugal, after the usual delay in such matters, came to an amicable understanding and arranged the boundaries of their mutual satisfaction. It placed a portion of the Jesuit missions under the jurisdiction of the Portuguese, which they had supposed to belong to Spain. The Jesuits refused to submit to this and inaugurated the necessary measures to resist it, being determined, if they could prevent it, not to submit to the dominion of Portugal. Their preference for Spain was because of the fact that the king of that country was more favorably inclined to them than the Portuguese king. But the history of the controversy justifies the belief that they would not even have submitted to the former, that is Spain, unresistingly, inasmuch as it had undoubtedly become their fixed purpose to retain the independence they had long labored to establish by maintaining their theocratic form of government. In other words, if given their druthers, they wouldn't have submitted to either Spanish or Portuguese authority, legitimate though it was. Given their druthers, they would have resisted both Spain and Portugal. But given a choice, they would choose to submit to Spanish authority over Portuguese. And it says they had been so accustomed to autocratic rule over the natives that they could not become reconciled to the idea of surrendering it to any earthly power. In this instance, however, they encountered an adversary of whose courage and capacity they had not the least conception, and whom they found in a brief period capable of inflicting a death blow upon the society, upon the Jesuit order and their Jesuit reductions in Paraguay. This was Sebastian Cavallo, Marquis of Pombal, who was the chief counselor of the Portuguese king. Cavallo, better known as Pombal, and the King of Portugal were both faithful members of the Roman Catholic Church and conducted the government in obedience to the Roman Catholic Church's requirements. It was a Roman Catholic country. The Pope was the God of this world to them, right? And it says, but neither of them was disposed to submit to the dictation of the Jesuits in Paraguay with regard to the question of boundary, which was entirely political, or to submit to their rebellion against legitimate authority. Such a question did not admit of compromise or equivocation. It presented a vital issue they could neither avoid nor postpone without endangering the government and forfeiting their own self-respect. Consequently, they inaugurated prompt and energetic measures to suppress the threatened insurrection of the Jesuits before it should be permitted to ripen into open and armed resistance. From that time forward, the controversy constantly increased in violence. The intense hatred of Pombal by the Jesuits has colored their opinions to such an extent that they deny to him, that is Pombal, either talents or merit, and inasmuch as they charge all the ensuing results to him, he is pictured by them more as a monster of iniquity than as a statesman of knowledgeable ability. All this, however, should count for nothing in deciding the real merits of the controversy. The whole matter is resolved into this simple proposition, that it was the duty of the government to vindicate and maintain its own authority in the face of Jesuit opposition. It had nothing to do with the Church, nor the Church with it. It did not involve any question of faith, but was confined solely and entirely to secular and temporal affairs. And if under these circumstances Pombal had quietly permitted the Jesuits to defy the government and consummate their object by successful rebellion against its authority, he would have won from Jesuit pens the brightest and most glowing praise. But his name would have gone into history as a betrayer of his country. With the foregoing facts impressed upon his mind, the reader will be prepared to appreciate the subsequent events which led to the expulsion of the Jesuits from all the Roman Catholic nations of Europe, and finally to the suppression and abolition of the Jesuit order as the only means of defense against its exactions and enormities. That is the extent to which the Roman Catholic world went to suppress and abolish the Jesuit order. The whole Roman Catholic Church was against them. The people, the kings and the governments under papal direction, and the papacy itself. It was the Catholics who stood up and demanded the extermination of the Jesuit order. That's what I view as being the only hope for this country. Post-Vatican Council II, when the ecumenical evangelibellies, those who once deserved the title Protestant, those who do not protest Rome anymore and wish to reunite with her, they're no help in this war against the Jesuits. They want to reunite with the Roman Catholic Church. They want to remain Baptists, Lutherans, Methodists, and Episcopalians, and on and on and on, but they want to reunite with the Roman Catholic Church. They want a union of church and state. They want a united Christianity, and they want to include the Roman Catholic Church in that. Matter of fact, they want to include the Roman Catholic Church as the superior member of this global Christianity that they want. But there's still hope, slim hope, that Roman Catholics in this country will become aware of the history of the Jesuits and do what the Catholics have always done: insist that the Jesuits be destroyed. Now, chapter 11 of the book is entitled The Portuguese and the Jesuits. It says, at the period referred to in the last chapter, the Jesuits were held in low esteem everywhere in Europe. They were severely censured, not alone by government authorities, but by the great body of the Christian people, more especially those who desired to save the Roman Catholic Church from their dangerous and baneful influences. The leading Roman Catholic governments were all incensed against them, the Jesuits, and it only required some master spirit, some man of courage and ability to excite universal indignation against them. Protestants had comparatively little to do with the matter. Nothing, indeed, but to make public sentiment somewhat more distinct and emphatic. Pombal understood thoroughly the character of the adversary he was about to encounter, the adroit artifices which the Jesuits, collectively and individually, were accustomed to practice, and by which they had often succeeded in obtaining assistance from unexpected quarters. Therefore, he resolved at the outset not to temporize with them, but to put in operation immediately a series of measures of the most active and energetic character. He may not have known that the other Roman Catholic governments would unite with that of Portugal, but he must have seen ground for believing that they would in the general displeasure they exhibited at the conduct of the Jesuits throughout Europe. Howsoever this may have been, he saw plainly his own line of duty toward the Portuguese government, and had not only the necessary courage, but the ability to pursue it. A royal council was held at the palace of the King of Portugal in 1757, at which he suggested, quote, the imperative necessity of removing the Jesuits from their post of confessors to the royal family, unquote, for the reason that the controversy in South America could not be satisfactorily settled, if at all, so long as they remained in a condition to influence the action and opinions of the king, that is, the government, in any degree whatsoever. Now let me stop right here. Here we're seeing the beginning, the very beginning of the extermination, the abolition of the Jesuit order by the Roman Catholic Church. This is through Pombal. And the very first thing he did was he put a wall of separation between the Jesuits and the ruling families. He separated the Jesuits so that they had no contact with the government. No longer could the Jesuits present themselves as spiritual advisors and confessors to hear the confessions of the ruling families. Their line of communication and courtship with power was broken. That's the first step that the Catholics of this country need to take to stop this Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. Kick the Jesuits out of the halls of government. That's the first thing Pombal did, and it eventually led to their suppression. That's where we need to start today. We'll be back tomorrow. Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.